Hitman is an internationally acclaimed AAA franchise from IO Interactive. It's had a film adaptation, a TV show, and 7 different games, including some fantastic titles on mobile. Hitman is environmental storytelling at its finest. There is no other game that beckons players to literally study the characters of its world quite like Hitman. The game is a masterclass. Which is why it might surprise you that Oliver Winding, a scriptwriter at IO Interactive who I had the opportunity to interview, is one of the most humblest people I've met in the games industry. Now, video game writers do not exactly have a reputation of humility. It takes a certain amount of skill to narrow down an entire department to just your name on your WGA script submission. Neil! Of course, I'm just kidding, Neil, but only half kidding. What I'm trying to say is I had a great time chatting with Oliver. We spoke for over an hour, and I've boiled that hour down to 20 to 25 concrete minutes that you could jump between. If 25 minutes is too long, I understand. There are time codes in the description of this video. Jump to whatever topics you prefer. But don't miss at the end of this video where I break down my key takeaways, a summary, if you will, of everything I learned from our conversation. With that being said, please support this video and my life's decisions by pressing that like button. Slap it! And I will see you in the video. Let's begin. One thing I wanted to start with is just to tell all our viewers, as always, particularly anybody joining us from IO Interactive's legal team, that we are welcome. We are not going to be covering any intellectual property, and as Oliver will state, you know, this is solely reflecting his own opinions, his own perspective in the games industry. So take what he says with a grain of salt. Don't trust everything.
I still love you. Don't worry.
So Oliver, tell us how did your career start in the games industry? How did you find yourself with this awesome, highly coveted job of being in the games industry, no less a writer in the games industry, which is probably one of the hardest positions to land?
It was by pure accident. Basically, I graduated from film school in 1997. That's how old I am. Well, like most writers, it's really hard to get a gig in films as well. After 6 years in the wilderness, I decided, no, I've got to get a job. I was getting a kid. We had to do something. And I used to work as a bartender where IO Interactive used to go when they started out. So I knew a lot of people. So, we always chatted and kind of there was some of us who graduated at the same time from different schools. And it also used to be sort of really pretty much our hangout. We used to go to this bar and just get drunk and talk and chat, and we had all the same interests: games, films, music. We sort of kind of grew up together. I also actually had one of Hitman's creators living at my flat for a while because he didn't have a place to live. So it was pure nepotism. I got into this. And it kind of started with being QA. And I worked on various early games and Hitman contracts. And then I got promoted to QA lead with some other people on Hitman Blood Money. And my boss at that time was then moving on to becoming a producer on the Kane & Lynch franchise. And he knew I'd gone to film school because we had known each other for ages. And he asked me if I was interested in writing Kane & Lynch. And that's how I got into the writing.
Since then, have you had to interview multiple times for different teams, or once you're in, you're in?
Yeah, I only did one interview.
What was that like? How'd they evaluate you?
Well, I think at that time we were talking, this is 2007. So writing for games didn't really have that much of a, there wasn't focus on it as much. We were still having, some pretty dire dialogue at that time in games. It was written by people who obviously weren't writers. So I think it was quite easy for me. I sort of approached it as a film script. So it was a very easy audition for me. because I knew how to write. I mean, not to boast, but even if I wasn't a very good writer, I still knew how to write.
What would be your advice to somebody who's facing that initial interview tomorrow?
I would say don't do what I did and approach it as a film. That's something I've learned since.
Hmm.
Games and films are very, very different and should never ever be confused with being the same thing. Write a cut sequence, for example, for an audition, and then sit down. Always write a cut sequence, and then try and write an actual in-game sequence. But sit down, play a game, find out how the mechanism works in a game. Take an easy game, take or something that is quite obvious to write for. I mean, for example, a Tomb Raider game or something like that, where you know how the mechanism works quite simply, um, and simply just picture how would you design this, and then write that as in script form. There's so many different ways of writing dialogue that there's no rules yet. I think that's also the problem for writing at the moment in literature, in film, in TV. There's so many rules we can follow, templates we can use. For games, we don't have that yet.
This is something I've experienced because I've been doing some videos on my channel where I try to look at screenplays from video games, and
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to get to get a hold of some of those. Where would you go for sort of example writing? Is it just playing the games, or is there some other resources that most people might not be aware of in order to really hone that craft?
that is a really good question. I have no idea. I would say play games, analyze them. Don't play. As a writer, you have to try and teach yourself to play, not to play.
Hmm.
You as a writer, you have to immerse yourself not into the gameplay, but into the whole atmosphere of the game. That's why I generally tend to prefer looking at other people play the game I'm working on than actually playing it myself, because I get caught in trying to play the game and I don't listen. You have to listen as a writer, and it's and really also listen to the faults. I think that's the kind of the problem that so many games fall into, is that there's not enough time to actually sit down and listen to how the dialogues work in the game. So they seem really weird and disjointed, you know. Um, it's all atmosphere. For me, it's atmosphere. For me, dialogue is sugar on top in a game, like good graphics.
For somebody who maybe isn't studying at a video game writing school, and maybe
Mm.
they're just studying in film, or they initially thought they would be in film, what are sort of the biggest misconceptions or differences for somebody who thinks they really know how to write films, but now
Mm.
wants to make the transition to writing games? What do they need to know?
Well, the big difference is you can't be subtle. I always say to when we get new writers in, they have to pretend that when they're writing dialogue, they have to pretend that the NPC just stands, with his arms down, stiff. You can't write and he fidgets with a piece of paper or takes out a cigarette, and because then we are already thinking hundreds and thousands of dollars in animation.
Yeah.
So you have to think incredibly cheaply. So everything has to be in the exposition of what they say and in the tone of the actor. It's almost, I would say the best example is, think of it as a radio play. Only audio, not visual. Of course, it's different rule with cutscenes, because you can start doing these things. That's what cutscenes are for. They're more elaborate. But if it's in-game dialogue, yeah, think of it as a radio play. That's my best advice.
When it comes to interviewing prospective writers, what are some of your favorite interview questions for evaluating them, or kind of what's the best way to tell if somebody's going to make it as a writer?
That's I don't think there's no such thing as a favorite question, because I think, all questions are good. There's no such thing as stupid questions, or obvious questions, because again, as I mentioned earlier, there's no structure in writing, so we don't know, we don't have the answer even to questions that seem really obvious. I think the way I like to screen people is their reaction to criticism. You'd be surprised how many people get really, really angry when you tell them that what they've written is not great. You know, of course, I'm very nice if it's terrible, but if I see a potential, you know, I will go in and criticize them in an interview. Say, not criticize them, but you know, be critical of some of the material and say, because you can learn it, but if people react hostile towards it, which yeah, I would say 70-80% people do.
Wow,
I'm not even,
80% have a negative
yeah,
reaction.
yeah. I've had so many angry emails written to me by people after an interview, um, and it's just instantly no. They're already out the door after 5 seconds, in my opinion. I'll let them rant and be angry, but and the reason for this is developing games. It changes constantly. You're rewriting because you're catering to something that's where the writing is not the important part. It's the gameplay that's the important part, and therefore it's iteration on iteration on iteration, and you've just got to be really willing and open to change. You're killing darlings by the day. I mean, not just killing them, you're butchering them. I mean, and that's part of the job. Don't fall in love with a sequence or a scene because it might not be there tomorrow.
How technical does a writer need to be? Are they expected to implement things on their own within IO? Or basically, do the engineers cater to your will and you just got to hand it to them in a Word document?
That is very for IO. It's the level designers who implement it. We have talked about having a narrative director, someone whose job is simply just to implement dialogue. It's come up, and I think we're all quite fans of the idea. We haven't tried it yet, and I think it would. It's kind of to be have a because often when level designers put dialogue in, it's sort of put in clunks. So it's like, okay, first this line plays, then this line plays, then this line plays. Whereas sometimes you actually want a slight pause, or you want them to cut in, and of course, level designers don't have time to think of these things. I think because there is so much run, I think it'd be wisest to have someone who only takes care of that. That would also remove a huge weight from the level designers. But again, writing as well is you're writing all the time, so it's also something that we don't have time to do either.
Are your writing projects collaborative? And if so, what does it look like writing with multiple people on a team?
Well, normally we have. I mean, for example, with the last few games I've worked on, we've had a head writer. I think we kind of approach it a bit more like a TV series. So you have the head writer who's created the overall art. Then we have a singular writer on one level. Then we have the ambient writer, and then we have the externals who take care of, and then we also have a head AI writer, and then we have externals who help everyone out for where we are needed or where we are pushed for time, and so it follows more of like a TV series model where you always have a head writer on it, and then sub writers below. I think it's mainly the head writer and the story writes and the actual level writer. They're the ones who talk the most, and then with the ambient and the story writer, they chat a lot. The AI writers are more technical because it's gameplay related. That's and especially for games like I worked on, like Hitman, the AI is actually the most important dialogue because that's what explains to you how you fail or if you're doing really well. So that's more gameplay related, actually.
Hmm.
But of course, we all sit down in the beginning, talk about tone. So at least we are in some kind of sync. But this what I'm gonna say now is we are very split. Also, even on our team, about the function of dialogue. I think dialogue is sugar on top. It makes the experience great, but the fundamental core of it is gameplay should be fun. And that and if gameplay dictates story, that makes it quite difficult to be linear. If that makes sense. I think it's you can't follow normal dramaturgical structures because it's a good example, which luckily doesn't happen as much anymore. But it's what I always used to call the ray gun in a knights and armor game. All of a sudden you introduce this really weird thing that just makes no sense in the universe, but it's a really cool feature, and it makes the game really good fun. And that, as a writer, you sometimes have to accept, even though it kind of breaks it, breaks the fantasy you're trying to create with your words and your story.
I've seen recently a resurgence of video games with a really strong narrative focus, such as God of War or The Last of Us or the new Star Wars game. I'm interested in how you think those sort of games are influencing the industry right now, if at all.
I think they're influencing the industry greatly. I think they're very. I mean, I should be careful. I don't want to offend anyone. I think our big mistake with them is I still think we are in early stages of structuring stories. I don't think they're not Citizen Kane yet. We haven't we haven't gotten to that point yet. Um, I think a problem they often fall in is that people start just listening to dialogue, and they really want to play the game. And I think it does have a big influence on people. Of course, I mean, the games you're mentioning have done really well, especially Last of Us, which really focused on, also, the whole sales campaign focused very much on the narrative. But again, at times I kind of felt I was more being part of an interactive film than a game. Um, but it's just a genre, I guess. I think it's more of a genre. I think we have to approach that kind of game more as a genre. Just remember your mistakes. You always go, this was costly, this was stupid. Um, but I think it's more I generally tend to move on once the game is finished. But one thing I'll always do is read the bad reviews, and very rarely read the good ones. Again, you read the bad reviews, you have to be able to accept the criticism, and then you take with you what you agree on. And there's often, I think, for a writer, it's most common, it's the tone you've written in that people dislike. Which can be, it's either too silly, or it's too infantile, or it's too macho, or it's too dark, or it's but again, it's something you can't really learn from, but you can always keep in the back of your head. Producing games is just hard. It's really hard to manage creativity. A production always falls apart, I think, and it's not something you can learn from. It's something you should just always be ready for when you go into the next production. Is that the plan will never hold.
What are some things that producers or engineers or designers can do to support their writing teams more?
I think we're lucky where I am right now. I think we are lucky we talk a lot. Writers and level designers should always be in conversation. Or as much, at least talk at least once or twice, 3 times a week, um, one way or another, be it over Teams or the big mistake that some people make is that they often think it takes the same amount of time to write as it does to speak it. Um, And that's a classic rookie mistake. You can't. I mean, otherwise we'd be finished with the script in a day. Um, but as long as you always talk to the person you work closely with, talk as much as you like. Really, you quickly find out who. When you start on a production, you quickly find out who are the important people to talk to. Talk to producers, of course, if you're seeing troubles in the distance, so have a red flag to wave. Talk to the level designer, and if you also have a main story writer, talk to them for the more creative aspects. Always talk to character art. That's a good one, especially as a writer. Keep and keep the character artists close to you because they're the ones who are going to be defining the characters you are writing. That's a classic rookie mistake that most people forget. And the character artists, they're standing there going, "But I don't understand who this person is."
Oliver, how would you say that passion or inspiration plays a role in your work?
As a writer, it's not as much passion and inspiration. Of course, passion and inspiration comes in because you have to think of stuff to write. So whatever you're interested in, whatever you, of course, gets reflected into the job, into what you're doing somehow. It's not always the case. Because, well, it depends on what genre you're writing. If you're writing something that's sort of sword and sorcery like, you can't start quoting André Gide or something. It'll just be weird. But I have two children, and sometimes they say they're getting old now, but I used to really love hearing what they said. When they were small, and they would say these strange abstract things, and you'd kind of take that and put it into a grown-up sense, and you can make something really fun out of that. I like to walk around listening to people talk. I think it's interesting to then put that into the games. More everyday life than actual passions that has an effect on my work.
Is there any interesting stories that you might have of how an everyday experience turned into a AAA moment?
I used to do some exercises if I would write AI, because with coders they really like, especially AI coders, they really like the idea of they've made this really cool reaction that your avatar can do, so they want them to sort of always say something when they do this systemic reaction. And I remember walking around the office one day because all of a sudden it was agreed that whenever this person would see someone, they would greet them. And I walked down this aisle at the office, and I just greeted everyone. And people got really, really freaked out by it. And I kept doing it. I kept walking back and forth saying hello. And then I went and I said this to the AI designer. I said, "You've got to check this out. This is really weird." And that way we could actually sort of make it a bit. So it was only every other or every fourth person they would greet.
I love that. Wow. So you didn't want to implement it, so you were like, let me just do this in real life and have everybody
Yeah.
call me a weirdo until they realize how ridiculous this is.
Yeah, I mean, it's like walking down the street. You don't say hello to everyone who passes you. It's
Wow, I love that. That's a really funny story.
but the
Um,
same I would say goes for ambience. There's also people really want. It's quite often that people will want uh, the NPCs in ambience to talk about what's happening on the level, and it's kind of like if you walk down the street to go and buy milk, and all the people you pass will all talk about you going to buy milk. That would be so super weird. I think these are sort of those are the things you should keep in mind, and that's why you should go out and go for a walk sometimes. Just listen.
so you talked about common, as you call them, rookie mistakes at a project level. What would you say are some mistakes you've observed at a career level from writers just getting started in the industry?
Stressing themselves out, I would say, and I've done this one myself as well. being overwhelmed by the amount of work that is there, getting confused by it. Um, Someone once said to me very wisely, remember, it's only a game. You're not saving the world. Um, it takes time to make games, and very often, I mean, I've been lucky. I've had incredibly nice and understanding producers who've understood, but unfortunately, I only discovered that too late. But don't stress out. You won't produce anything that's good by stressing. And sometimes some days are better than others. Some days you can write 20 pages and it just flies out. Other days you write one page, and usually that one page is really, really bad. It's Don't force it. Let it come. It's only a game, and remember, it has to be fun. I think that's also something that quite often happens, especially during crunch periods. The fun disappears, and it becomes mechanical, and it's sort of this is a bit of a sidetrack, but I think it kind of explains it quite well. I remember the work with a game director who said, Oliver, don't have an NPC say I'm bored, because if they say that they're bored, then the player will feel they are bored. And I think he has a very good point in players are not idiots. They absorb they somehow subconsciously absorb how a game was made, produced, which is probably the reason why there's such a rise in indie games at the moment, because they're kind of free from some of the pressures that we are in AAA games. Remember, it's fun. It should be fun. And if you think it's fun, most likely most players will think it's fun as well. There'll always be haters.
Oliver, I wanted to thank you for answering our questions. I know I and anybody watching this is going to really appreciate your time. So once again, a huge
Let's
talk
thank
takeaways
you.
because there was a lot.
And
Oliver is a
to
proponent
everyone
of
out there,
playing lots of games. He says
lovely
that's
to
the
talk to
best
you.
way to see how other people are using the medium. But more than just playing the games, he says a writer must listen. And by that, he means you need to see other people playing the games. So maybe that means going to your favorite game and doing a Let's Play, watching a Let's Play YouTube video, and seeing how that person responds to the narrative beats that you engaged with. How do they do that differently than you? And then ultimately, how do they respond to the beats of your own story, and seeing how they react. In a way, he's sort of explaining how you need to play the game, but also have a third-person perspective and in sort of analyzing how it's affecting you. He also says those effects can't be subtle. You can't be subtle when you're writing for video games. He advocates this idea of thinking of if it's like a radio play. And in a radio play or a podcast, you wouldn't have any visuals at all. So what would it look like if the script was written with the dialogue very literal, right? We're talking like Shakespearean almost. What would that look like? And also think cheaply. So he speaks to the budget constraints of a lot of video games and how, it might be a little expensive to get a fancy animation of somebody looking mischievous. How could you communicate that through dialogue? That's his challenge. Next, he says you need to learn to take criticism well. This was a bit of a shock to me that 80% of the applicants he interviews don't take criticism well. Like, that's huge. Especially in an industry where you're going to be getting a lot of revision. That's something that I think we could all work on, just taking criticism well. It reminds me of this interview question for designers, actually, where they take the designer, the prospective designer, into the interview room, and they say, hey, what color is Mario's hat? And Mario has a red hat, and that's what the applicant will probably say. However, the interviewer then says, no, I think it's yellow. And your job as the applicant is to convince him otherwise. And really what he's looking for is like, is this person going to become irate? Are they going to think I'm just a complete idiot because I disagree with them? Or what ways are they going to use to convince me? So I think that's a pretty creative interview question. I'd be interested to see how that might be used for writers. Now, we talked about killing your darlings in the other video. Oliver has a different phrase. He says you need to butcher them, right? It seems like in his workplace that they're moving through ideas like a mile a minute, right? So you need to be okay with letting go of ideas and maybe not getting too stuck to one particular concept. With that being said, how important is the narrative to the game? This is a big discussion we had throughout the entirety of the video, but exploring what does it mean to have a narrative core versus a gameplay core. He's on the side of narrative is, as he says, sugar on top. Really, the focus should be gameplay. There are other developers who certainly think differently, and it's interesting to see all those perspectives. Now, one of the things he considers is whether or not we should call these interactive games where they're really focused on the story, should they be called games at all? Should they just be called interactive films? Or maybe it's just a different genre of games? That was, just extending that discussion. Oliver really says there's an important value in working with your XFN, right? Your cross-functional, your other teammates, people who aren't writers. You need to have great communication with them. And Oliver defines great communication as, at a minimum, constant communication. He is a strong advocate for talking with other people on your team and kind of getting everybody on board. He specifically highlights the value of getting someone like a character artist on board with the narrative design because they're the ones who actually need to put all that crazy backstory into the guy's face, right? So really just getting everybody involved in the decision-making process. It does seem like they're a lot more democratic in this studio than maybe something like God of War, which I worked on, right? So it does seem like there's different perspectives in the industry, right? Every team does it a little bit differently. With that being said, he says, show, don't tell, right? And that's something we hear a lot in the games industry. In fact, there's a book which advocates play, show, then tell, right? If you could put it in an interactive experience, that's the best. That's what the medium's for. If you have to show them in a cutscene, okay. And if you're just going to tell them about it, well, at least they know. But frankly, it's always best to get that engagement, to get that player agency when possible. Finally, Oliver says, remember, it's just a game. We're not saving the world here. Interesting advice given a recent quote. It's not coming to me right now, but something to consider. Again, I've seen a lot of perspectives on this. I remember I told the very same to Scott, my co-writer, and he said to me, hey, Matthew, yeah, we're not saving lives, but we're giving people something to live for. So I think there's a lot of perspectives on it. I've definitely changed my view myself, but I'm interested what you think. So tell me in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, please push subscribe and you'll see more like this. And if you liked it, then give it a like. Thanks.